Hi everyone, it's Maddie. Welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all having a good day. Welcome to day 1, November 1st, 2018 of Diabetes Awareness Month. And today's question is kind of broad and, is going to be a little longer, but I think it's extremely important to talk about because any of us who have diabetes can get really frustrated or irritated or be peeved if people do not know the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So today's question is, what are the differences and some similarities between type 1 and type 2 diabetes? Well, I'm going to jump into the similarities first, just because the list of similarities is much shorter than the list of differences. So first of all, a similarity. Well, both types of diabetes, no matter if you're type 1 or type 2, we all have a hard time controlling our own blood sugar with our own bodies. In order for us to control our blood sugar, some of us have to use medications or insulin, and others of us can get away with just lifestyle and diet. With that being said, depending on the person, the level of therapy can vary, and also it depends on what kind of diabetes. I will explain that more when we get to the differences, which one can get away with less help right away first. Another thing is people usually, if they have diabetes, they will be following a healthy lifestyle, or at least trying to follow a healthy lifestyle, meaning that we watch how many carbohydrates we put in our body. We try to make sure that we're getting enough activity and that we are following our doctor's orders as far as taking medication and adapting to different changes in our lifestyle. We need to make sure we're following that. Otherwise, we can end up with, both types of diabetes can end up with complications in the future, which aren't very pretty. But I will explain in a later video what can kind of happen if we don't take care of diabetes, either type of diabetes. And really the final thing is genetics. Type 2 diabetes tends to have a little more genetic component. If you have a first-degree relative, such as a mother or father with type 2 diabetes, you are very likely to end up with type 2 diabetes yourself. Type 1 does have some genetic component, however, you don't necessarily have to have a family history to end up with type 1 diabetes. I do have a family history of type 1. I have an aunt and a cousin who live with it, but neither of my parents, my mother nor my father, have diabetes, so I had about a 1 in 100 chance of contracting diabetes, and I did. I ended up with type 1 diabetes, so that's kind of how that goes. Again, even if you don't have anybody that you're directly related to that has diabetes, but you have some sort of diabetes in your family, you are more likely than someone who does not have a history of diabetes in their family to end up with having a hard time controlling your blood sugar. With that being said, some people end up being the first in their family to end up with diabetes, and they had no family history that they were aware of prior to. So again, not a hard and fast rule. There are tons of exceptions. Before I jump in more to the differences between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, I'm going to put a little disclaimer. I don't know everything there is to know about type 2 diabetes because I do not live with type 2 diabetes. I live with type 1 diabetes. Just wanted to put that out there. I'm sure there are tons more differences and similarities we could talk about for hours and hours and hours, but I'm not going to do that because this video would start to be boring and long and get way too complicated. So I'm going to kind of do like a back and forth. I'll do something about type 1, which is what I live with, and something about type 2, and kind of like compare them head to head, what kind of happens. There's a lot of opposites, but then there's a lot of things that blend together, if that makes sense. So, let's begin. The first major difference I can think of is type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease. What do you mean by autoimmune? So, autoimmune means that our own body has basically turned against us. In a type 1 diabetic, we typically have antibodies that turn against the cells in our pancreas called the beta cells that secrete insulin. And once these antibodies start attacking the cells in our pancreas that secrete insulin, our insulin production begins to decrease until we are finally diagnosed, and 80 to 90% of them are already destroyed. In contrast, type 2 diabetes is not an autoimmune disease. It's typically caused by a poor lifestyle, such as not eating very healthy or not getting enough exercise. But then again, there are exceptions to the rule. I'm sure there are some type 2 diabetics who have led a very healthy lifestyle and still end up with the disease just because of their genetics or their environmental factor or their body just fails them. It happens. We'll go back to type 1. Type 1, typically type 1 diabetics are going to be extremely insulin sensitive, meaning that whatever insulin we get from an outside source we will use well. I am one of those insulin sensitive type 1 diabetics. Mainly this is because we don't make any insulin, so any insulin we get, we're going to use well. In contrast, a type 2 diabetic will typically be insulin resistant. They end up, when they are diagnosed, their body makes a ton of insulin because their body doesn't properly respond to the insulin they make. Their cells and their tissues become resistant to it, so therefore they need a lot more insulin to move the sugar from the blood into the tissues for energy. So that's kind of how that happens. However, I'm sure there are some type 2 diabetics that really don't have a problem with insulin resistance if they follow their diet and control their diabetes. And in contrast, there are some type 1 diabetics, especially those who have type 1.5 diabetes. I won't get into an explanation of that because that will get this video will get long and complicated. Type 1.5 diabetes is also known as latent autoimmune disease of adults. And this typically is a person who is diagnosed with type 1 diabetes after the age of 30. They can have a little bit of insulin resistance where they're not as sensitive as maybe some type 1 diabetics. Again, there's exceptions to every rule. Another difference is age. Again, this has changed over the years as we're starting to realize that there are more and more young people being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes because of the obesity crisis, especially here in America. And there are more and more older people getting diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, again, just because some people have the latent autoimmune disease of adults where the antibodies don't really start kicking in right away, or they take a very, very long time to destroy a lot of the beta cells. With that being said, those are the exceptions, not the rule. The rule is typically younger people are diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. I myself was diagnosed at age 19 and I just turned 20, so I was still fairly young at diagnosis, but not as young as some. If I had to take a guess, I'd say most people who are diagnosed with type 1 diabetes are probably diagnosed between the ages of 5 and 15. Again, here's the contrast to type 2. If you are type 2, you are probably diagnosed later on in your adulthood, probably after the age of 40. Is when people typically start seeing problems if they have a family history of type 2 or they start seeing problems with blood sugar control. So that leads into the next difference between them. Typically a type 1 diabetic is going to be insulin dependent right from the get-go because again we don't really make enough insulin or no insulin at all to control blood sugar, so therefore we have to get insulin from an outside source via injections, or a pump typically is how it is administered. And a type 2 diabetic usually starts out as non-insulin dependent, meaning that if they catch the disease and they commit to changing their lifestyle with their diet and exercise, they can typically stay off of insulin for quite a while. However, if that doesn't work, they can progress to medications that help their body make more insulin to combat insulin resistance or help their body better respond to the natural insulin that they make. With that being said, it doesn't mean that they're going to be like this forever. A lot of type 2 diabetics do end up having to be on insulin injections eventually, and they become an insulin-dependent type 2. This might take several years, or that might not happen for them at all. Again, depends on the person, depends on how well they want to control their diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is less common than type 2 diabetes. So if you think in the whole aspect of the world, about 10% of the whole entire world's population lives with some sort of diabetes. Of that 10%, only 5% have type 1 diabetes. The other 95% have type 2. So type 2 is way more common. Type 1 is way less common. Another important point, type 1 diabetes isn't preventable. There's nothing I could have said, done, ate, wore, danced about that could have stopped me from getting type 1 diabetes. You have the genetic components, you have an environmental trigger, you have the autoantibodies, you will eventually probably progress to having type 1 diabetes point in your life. However, some people that do have the antibodies do not develop type 1 diabetes. Again, it's a whole environmental trigger. I won't get into too much detail as why some people have the genes and the antibodies and never end up with diabetes and others don't. If you want a video on that, I maybe would be interested in making one, because I do like learning about the science and the genetic components beyond all this stuff. But basically, there's nothing you can do to prevent type 1 diabetes. Type 2 can be more prevented in that you can't really change if you have a big family history of type 2 diabetes, but you can, however, watch your diet, exercise regularly, stay in close contact with your doctor, get monitored closely every year if you have a family history to prevent ending up with type 2 diabetes or not progressing severely with type 2 diabetes. So that's kind of how that works. Typically, a type 1 diabetic can experience an acute complication from high blood sugars called diabetic ketoacidosis. This is usually caused by a lack of insulin. Therefore, if you are a type 2 diabetic, you will typically not go into DKA. So type 1 diabetics typically will see DKA maybe at some point during the lifetime of the diabetic, and type 2s will usually never end up in ketoacidosis. If you want to know more about ketoacidosis, wait till day 5. I have a whole video coming out on what diabetic ketoacidosis is. The other thing I can think of the difference between these two is the onset. Typically, a type 1 diabetic will only experience symptoms for maybe a few months before they are diagnosed. The onset's very rapid, only because as soon as our insulin production goes down into the tanks, we get very sick very quickly, and therefore we're going to get diagnosed quickly. However, even if we get diagnosed from those horrible symptoms, usually at that point 80 to 90% of the cells in our pancreas that secrete insulin are completely destroyed. So we kind of have to cling to life on the last 10% that are either alive or they end up getting destroyed anyway. I will get more into that in a different video, so stay tuned when we go through this type of phase with type 1 diabetes, but that's all I'll say for now. And typically, if you are a type 2 diabetic, the onset is much more gradual. It might take a type 2 diabetic years and years of having different symptoms and signs before they realize what is going on in their body. And mainly for this is because they still make their own insulin, but they make more and more because their body becomes more and more resistant. So it takes them longer for them to realize that they have a problem. If you stay tuned for tomorrow's video, we're going to talk more of the symptomatology of diabetes and what you kind of experience before you're diagnosed. This is all the differences and similarities that I can think of off the top of my head. However, I'm going to end with this. If you or someone else you know has made fun of diabetes in the past, please share this with them. A lot of people believe that you get diabetes from eating too much sugar. Well, this isn't true. I'll admit it, when I was a non-diabetic, I used to think the same thing. I used to think, oh, the person probably just consumed a really poor diet and ended up with diabetes. Well, not true, because I have type 1 diabetes, and it's nothing I ate as a teenager. I didn't eat too many lollipops and candies as a teenager to end up with type 1 diabetes. And obviously, too, a type 2 diabetic might have a problem with their diet. However, that doesn't always mean that's true. There are probably, like I said, tons of type 2 diabetics that live a fairly healthy lifestyle, but for whatever reason they are insulin resistant, or they have the genetic components for it and just end up with it no matter what they do. So please do not make fun of anybody with diabetes. Don't assume that you know everything, because you probably don't. Don't make fun of people if they have to give themselves injections, if they have to check their blood sugar. If they are watching their diet closely, please don't make fun of them. Don't make fun of anybody with diabetes, because diabetes is a challenge. It doesn't go away either. You just can't get rid of it, especially type 1. You can't get rid of it. I have it. There's no way it's going to go away unless they develop a cure for it, which there's no cure yet, unfortunately. So I have to live with it. That being said, do not make fun of anybody living with a chronic illness, no matter if it's diabetes or not. Do not poke and prod and make fun of people, especially if someone is tired or seems worn out. Remember that we all go through traumas in our life. Like I said, some of us, like myself and all you diabetics out there, deal with a chronic illness for your whole entire life. And some of us go through other traumas where we have good times, we have bad times. It's just like diabetes. We have good days, we have bad days. More into that later, but I think that just about sums everything up. Like I said, just be kind, be patient, and just don't nag at people for this kind of stuff, because I didn't ask to have diabetes. It was put upon me for whatever reason. I will put it out there that I do believe in God. If you are not super religious, or for whatever reason have a different religious value or belief, that's okay. I respect it, but please respect that I do believe in God, and I think God puts this disease on certain people for a reason, because I think he just has a purpose behind it. So beyond that, I hope you, if you are a diabetic, especially a type 1 diabetic, share this with your non-diabetic family and friends, so that we can spread awareness and put an end to myths and misconceptions about diabetes in general. Until my next video, I hope you take care, God bless, and I will see you tomorrow for day number 2 of Diabetes Awareness Month. Bye, everybody.